Energy Voices. This is Expo's podcast with relevant voices on the future of energy. Today's guest, Tim Nelson, Executive Director of the organization Hope for Justice. Tim Nelson is interviewed by Energy Voices host Karin Frei.
Tim Nelson, as the CEO of Hope for Justice, you are trying to put an end to modern slavery. It's a goal that's rather heroic. Personally, has it always been a calling, sort of Tim Robin Hood?
It's so great to be with you. I think from my perspective, I never dreamed that I would ever be working for an NGO. I certainly didn't know anything about this issue. I was sitting as an advisor to an offshore investment trust in America, and a friend who worked for a children's charity whilst I was there invited me out for dinner. And I met a chap who told me about this issue. Whilst we were out for dinner, he was on the phone to Condoleezza Rice, who was working for the Bush administration. And he was arguing about the downgrading on the human trafficking register about India. He had been in India the week before and he had seen girls in cages. And I listened intently. He came off the phone and I asked him a myriad of questions about what he had just talked about. And I looked to what I could do to help. And as I turned to offer him some money, his challenge to me was that, I don't need you to give me any money. I just need you to give your life to trying to find an answer to helping those people who are held enslaved across the world. So slightly a bit more than I thought that I would have to give, and certainly have been trying to do that ever since.
So if we're talking about modern day slavery in the context of energy and climate change, how big of a problem is it? Where would you say it's the most acute?
So for me, I see it as a massive, massive issue. I can give you a couple of examples where I think this comes to bear. There is a drive across the whole of Europe to see the electrification of vehicles. The problem is that the unintended consequence of key commodities which are involved in battery production. So a key component of batteries is cobalt. And somewhere in the region of between 65 and 70% of all cobalt is mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The challenge is that most of that is being mined by both children and men in exploitation. The Paris Accord now says that for us to move to electrification across Europe, it will lead to a 30 times production needed more of cobalt. So that's 30 times more people who will be exploited to ensure that we can move to electric vehicles. And I think certainly that is something that most people who are buying the new Tesla or other electric branded vehicle, they're not aware of. They're not aware of the impact of that. They're not aware of the difficult realities that will come through that issue.
Let's define modern slavery. I've heard around 40 million people worldwide are in such a slavery situation. But what does it actually mean? What does modern slavery entail?
Yeah, so modern day slavery, the number 40.3 million comes from the ILO, the International Labour Organization. And internationally, that's seen as the best estimate for how many people who are held enslaved. The term modern day slavery covers a massive area of different variants of exploitation. And that's everything from sexual exploitation, domestic servitude, labor trafficking, and also includes forced marriage and organ harvesting, where individuals are taken for the organs that they have. But the dominant areas that we see on an international basis, the three that get talked about the most, either under the term of human trafficking or modern day slavery, tend to be sexual exploitation, domestic servitude, and labor trafficking.
Do you have an estimate on modern slavery in Switzerland?
Yes, certainly. There is a report that is prepared by the Trafficking in Persons Division of the US Department of State. And what they're now seeing in Switzerland is that, unfortunately, the situation has got worse in Switzerland, not better in the last few years. And actually, in the last year, Switzerland has been downgraded to what would be a tier 2 country, which effectively shows that there isn't the adequate response by the authorities to the issues that we're now seeing on the ground.
So what are we doing wrong?
So it's a number of different issues and a number of different areas that we're seeing. So part of it is with regards to the way that the police deal with this across the whole of these issues that we're talking about. So are prosecutions happening, and are those perpetrators being held to account for what they've done wrong? I think in Switzerland alone, 63% of all traffickers that were convicted were given suspended sentences. So if you're a trafficker in Switzerland, it's almost like saying that the threat of you serving time is quite low, but yet the potential benefit of what you can make if you are a trafficker is significantly higher. And therefore, I would say, as a person stepping back and analyzing what you're doing in Switzerland, it's that there's not enough people aware of what the issues are. There's not enough people dedicated to deal with the issue itself. And there isn't the level of resources and understanding to tackle the underlying issues that we're seeing of exploitation across Switzerland.
So let's take that cobalt mine in Congo in a very practical way. What can you actually do there? How would you free someone, or how would Hope for Justice free someone there?
So the threat by legislation for companies is they need to tidy up their supply chain. What we are seeing in the likes of the Democratic Republic of Congo is companies, in the desire to access the commodities, are almost throwing the rules out of the window. It's almost the Wild West in terms of your acquisition of products and commodities, and it doesn't exist anywhere else. And I think for Hope for Justice, we've been working with businesses for a number of years under a division we called Slave Free Alliance. So in key sectors, what we've done through Slave Free Alliance is we've had different individual companies, although they are competitors to each other, come together to ensure that they don't compete on human rights. And if they've got a single source supply, then it's ever so much more important for them to use their buying power collectively to bring about a change. So it's only by working together that you can then ensure that something changes.
But what's the leverage, Is it the image? Is it that the customer in the end expects things to happen? Or what's the leverage?
We had a case in the UK where there was a newspaper article that was placed on a Sunday into a newspaper about a business that had a potential modern day slavery happening in their direct business. Within 2.5 days, that company had lost nearly £2 billion off their value, because the major investment companies have ESG boards. And if they think that there's any form of reputational damage that's going to come to them, they will pull their investment. And therefore, the value of that company is going to be so much less. So that's the first stage. The second is from a public image perspective. If we have companies that are quite happy to be complacent around what's happening, and a news story comes up about them, it will detrimentally affect how consumers see them as a company. Now, the benefit for me and what I'm trying to do by working with a number of international banks is I'm trying to see as well whether banks and insurance companies would be prepared to offer discounts for open and transparent supply chains. So to effectively provide a carrot rather than a stick.
And do they?
And that's what a number of banks are currently looking at around how could they incorporate that within their business itself.
What would you say for a local population is having raw materials like that? Is that a curse or a blessing?
I think what you've got to look at are that there are countries across the world that have looked at the raw materials and acted appropriately with them. And that's where they generally are not held by a few, but for the benefit of everyone. And the rule of law is such an important part for any government in their approach to the commodities that they have, whether it's the commodities of having raw materials or whether it's the workforce that they've got. Every government gets to set the temperature that they're prepared to have across these areas.
I mean, if I were absolutely cynical, I'd say exploitation of human labor is as old as human history. Do you see patterns? I mean, does history repeat itself wherever and whenever the chance arises? Or do you think we actually progress and learn? Or is the ice of civilization just thin?
I mean, that's a big statement. I look at this issue and I go, there's never been more people held enslaved than there are now in human history. Never been more. 40.3 million, that's the highest level it's ever got to. But yet we have the amazing opportunity to make different decisions. The UN Sustainable Development Goal is that by 2030, we would see slavery taken from the supply chain of businesses. And I think that is a reality that could come to bear, that could actually happen, but it requires culture to shift. And I think what you're alluding to is, almost you could look at it cynically and say culture hasn't shifted on this. People still want to make profit. Therefore, there'll be a percentage of people that want to exploit people to make profit. I look at it and say, if we change the rules, if as a culture we will not tolerate this, then actually it will bring about the biggest change that we have ever seen in the world's approach to modern day slavery. And this area of modern day slavery within businesses is the key area that I believe should change first.
Let's talk about cultural change in the context of solar panels. I'd like to quote James Cockayne. He is the first Australian anti-slavery commissioner.
Around 40% of polysilicon used in solar panels comes from Xinjiang, where forced labor appears to be state policy. But that polysilicon shows up on most panels.
Tim, how do you deal with countries like, for instance, China, who might have other views on how humans should be treated? Can you negotiate?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen different countries have different approaches. So as of the 21st of June, the US government brought in the Uyghur Protection Act. Now, that act itself has a presumption of guilt. And for those who are on who don't know about that, it's that basically in Xinjiang, we have a population of Uyghurs that are being forced to work as slave labor. Those individuals held against their will. And as James has commented on, the high percentage of polysilicate that comes means that really solar panels themselves are cheap because they're being made through forced labor across what's being done. I think it's incumbent upon every business that works with governments to ensure that they don't tolerate modern day slavery happening.
The problem is that China is a main, if not the main supplier of solar panels.
Okay, so there are lots of opportunities that businesses can take about where they have supply from and how they can add additional understanding to where the products and services are coming from. For a product like polysilicate, the US government have said clearly, we are not going to tolerate these products coming unless you can prove they're coming from a supplier where that doesn't exist. And for this issue, as a result, we're seeing massive amounts of solar panels being held up in withhold release orders in the US.
If we're talking about climate change, it's urgent that things happen, that we install those solar panels. If they're cheap, people installing them. If they're expensive, the transition is slower. So it's a terrible situation.
It absolutely is. But I think it doesn't take any extra time for people to ask the right questions. If the cost of climate change is greater, then I think that's a cost that we should pay if it means that people will not be exploited. Because the people who are involved and being exploited are someone's son and someone's daughter. I think if you understand it from that perspective and understand if they were your son or your daughter, you would want something doing about it. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to pay the appropriate price for climate change and to ensure that we do it in a way that protects people, that the weak, the marginalized, the poor, the oppressed, that we don't live in a world that would tolerate this happening. You know, quite often most people only ask about price and quality of the products. They're not even asking about the issues of the workers themselves. If you want to buy tuna fish, there's more information held on the tuna that you're buying internationally than on the people who are working on the boats. Where I can tell you whether or not that tuna was caught through a net or line fed. I can tell you what date it was caught on. I can tell you where it was shipped, but I can't tell you anything about the ships. And that's a little bit around the problems that we see now, that more people are bothered about the commodity itself rather than the people themselves that are involved in it. And I think we have a responsibility as buyers, whether we're a small company or a bigger company, that we can all do more to address this problem.
We've talked about solar panels, we've talked about raw materials. How do you see the situation in other areas? I mean, transport, cheap labor, is it an issue?
I wouldn't say in terms of the shipping, in terms of the ability to transport goods, where you have companies that say, we want to pay a low wage, what you end up finding is there aren't many people who want to take the very lowest wage. So they'll look to use recruitment companies or they'll look to use intermediaries to try and bring on board that workforce. And where we see those intermediaries coming in, it's a vulnerability for many companies. And that's where we can see modern slavery flourish, because those individual recruitment companies themselves can have holdover passports and hold people's bank accounts. They can stop people getting the wages that the companies want to pay and ensure that people effectively exploit those workers.
So how far is legislation, or how far are you with your organization? How far is the situation progressed? As in, is it as you said before, Wild West, or what's being done so far?
Well, we've seen a steady progression of legislation, and it's picking up pace. So we saw in 2000, we saw Governor Schwarzenegger bring in specific legislation for California. That was picked upon by the UK government. In 2015, they created the Modern Slavery Act. Within it, Section 54 requires companies that bring an annual revenue of 36 million or more to have a statement in their accounts. That was built upon in Norway in 2017 and also in the recent legislation in Australia. The Australian government was the first in New South Wales to carry a fine that would be brought in if people could see that there was an issue. But then that has now been built upon by the German legislation. And really, that German legislation is a game changer for what this issue is globally, because it now carries with it the threat of a 2% global turnover fine for any company that's complicit or compliant within modern day slavery for each occurrence. So we're not talking about something of a small level of threat. This is now being deemed as big a threat as GDPR was in the US, as Sarbanes-Oxley was. Many companies are now starting to really try and ask questions that they've never done before, to have transparent and open supply chains so that they understand every aspect of where the business itself is sourcing goods.
Thank you so much, Tim Nelson from Hope for Justice. Let me, to finish up, just pop two personal questions. What is your daily contribution to a sustainable climate and energy situation?
For me personally, I would say around recycling. My family, we look at everything we possibly can do to recycle everything that we have, so that what we're putting into the world isn't just waste, but actually things that could be productive and reused across what we're doing.
And if you were king for a day, what would be the first, again, very practical action you would take?
I think, to be king for a day, you've got to really use your influence and power wisely. And I think if I was given that opportunity, I would want to bring legislation that really had the victim of modern day slavery at the heart of it. And I'd want to ensure that CEOs didn't just pass this responsibility on to someone as a junior member within the team, but really looked at the problems and issues in their business. And I'd bring legislation to bear to ensure that was the case.
Energy Voices. We are happy to receive your remarks and feedbacks. Write to podcast@axpo.com or Twitter using the hashtag Energy Voices.